Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. So happy that you have tuned in to this wonderful thing we got going on here called All in Context. I'm really excited for this one because, as I said in the comments or in the description, this is a family affair because I have my two cousins on who are sisters, and then it's my brother and I. And so this is going to be really cool. I'm excited for it. We're going to be talking about public policy. One of the things that we often hear about, especially at times like this in an election, you hear how horrible every candidate is. Well, depending on which side of the aisle you are or which side your friends are on. Facebook will tell you which candidate is the worst because of the policy they will put in place. And so we love to talk about policy and how horrible certain people's are and how good others are. But a lot of times I don't even think we know what policies are in place in our own communities, in our own lives, and how they're affecting us. So these people on this call, we spend a lot of time talking about situations that we find ourselves in and the situation other people are in. So decided to share that conversation with you all. And so I'm going to bring them on. You will see on your screen Naya, Imani, and Curnis, who I'm going to try to make sure I call Curnis because that is not what we called him growing up. That's his government name.
That's right.
But because he's a third, I might call him Trey sometimes. So if you hear me say Trey, I'm talking about Curnis. So you guys are all on the screen. Naya, tell them a little bit about yourself, just your background, your connection with this conversation, everything.
Sure. First, thank you so much, Keon, for having us and for hosting this really important conversation. My name is Naya Hope, and I work in public policy in the private sector most recently. And prior to transitioning to the private sector, I worked for the federal government for about 12 years, worked for the Department of Defense, for the Secretary of Defense, managing state and local government economic development on behalf of the Secretary of Defense in the Office of Economic Adjustment, and served as the Deputy Director of that office. We did a lot of work with state and local government leaders in advancing specific, executing federal programs, but also advancing specific legislation, specifically around construction of schools and roads around military installations. I have worked in the space of economic development for the duration of my career. Prior to joining the Office of Economic Adjustment, I worked for the Economic Development Administration. I worked for a local community development financial institution in Orlando, Florida, and I worked for the British government for a period of time doing research on workforce development for ethnic minorities. My job is as the VP of Global Public Policy for the JP Morgan Chase Policy Center, which I joined in December of 2019. And in that role, I'm responsible for working to identify and advance policy that can increase economic inclusion for excluded populations, and basically doing that in a manner that is consistent with the interests of the bank, and also that produces the greatest economic impact and access for individuals and communities, the individuals and communities that we are focused on removing barriers for. So that's about it for me. I'll turn it over
Awesome.
to next.
So thank you for that. Excited to have you on. I know we've had some really good conversations about Orlando, about the country, about housing, about economic development. So excited to kind of get in that. Next up, we have Imani Hope. Imani, tell me a little bit about yourself. I'm gonna put you on the big screen so everybody can see you.
Whoop, whoop. Um, hey everyone, I'm Imani. I'm going to be more brief than my sister. Um, I work in the space of education policy. I currently work for a nonprofit organization called Teach for America, and I lead the alumni and community affairs work in the New York region. My background is in education, from working in the classroom to working with a national political advocacy organization in DC called the National League of Cities. I've worked for local ed fund, doing some um, sort of funding and investment work in Jacksonville and Duval County, prior to coming to New York and working for Teach for America. I also am currently a student at Harvard Graduate School of Education, getting my EDM in education policy and management. So this is a topic that is very close, near and dear to my heart, both in sort of pedagogy in school and also in practice in my day-to-day work.
That wasn't short.
It was a lot shorter, boo.
So you're trying to troll me out here.
She's got some sibling rivalry. My favorite picture of you all is the one that gets shared all the time of Naya. Is it you sitting on top of Imani? Is that what's going on? Right.
I don't recall.
Right, right. It was so long ago, so you guys were still wearing the white stockings with the little borettes or whatever they're called. Anyway, next up we have my brother, Curnis, Upkins the third. Trey, tell him a little bit about yourself.
Hello, everyone. Okay, that's cool. Like Keon said, my name is Curnis Upkins III. I'm a Mississippi guy, born and raised and worked for my entire career so far. I'm in economic development, so it's cool to have this tie in that field with Naya. My work has been here. I've worked right now. I work for Hinds County Economic Development Authority. I'm currently acting executive director for that organization. But I've also worked on a regional level with an organization in Hattiesburg, Mississippi called the Area Development Partnership that covered 3 counties. And I've also worked at a college, Jackson State University, an HBCU. I worked there for the Center for University-Based Development. And there we did community development work. So I've had a nice mix of economic development and community development over this time. And since Imani mentioned, education, my bachelor's is in business administration from the University of Southern Mississippi and have a master's in urban and regional planning from Jackson State University.
Fantastic. All right, so love that. Let's get started. One of the things that we always talk about, as I mentioned in the intro, is we always talk about policy and public policy and how policies are impactful. What is public policy? How would you define it? And feel free, anybody, to jump in. What is public policy? Why does it exist?
So I can jump in with what I think is hopefully a real simple explanation. I like simplicity. But I think public policy is just, it's answers it's answers to big questions. It's solutions to big problems. When you look at the sort of big bucket areas of public policy, they exist in spaces that are that impact the public across all different demographics across the country, and policy is written, whether you agree with it or not, to address certain key issues and key challenges. And I think the 2 things that have to be true is that, number one, there has to be consensus that whatever the thing is actually a problem or a challenge or an issue. And number 2 is that there has to be a belief that it is something that can be solved by the government or some government entity. And I think where those 2 factors are true, you find public policy at that intersection.
Good. Any other?
Yeah, I would agree with Imani's comments, and also sort of include in there, build on that, and include legislation and also sort of precedents in terms of practice that is put forth by our legislators and our elected officials that address these big problems that Imani talked about. And so policies are often written in law, in legislation, or in guidance, or in interpretation of specific laws, and they become a part of. I mean, a lot of it is written. Some of it's not written, but it basically becomes a part of the way, or it's a significant part of the way that we engage with certain problems or certain issues, and it sort of directs the trajectory of the work that happens, and the efforts that take place around those particular issues.
Yeah, I agree with Imani and Naya. I just feel like public policy, the essence of it, involves rules, ordinances, laws, that's intended to cause people to do something. So either to cause people to start something, to stop something, or to limit some form of activity. And I think the overall goal of it is to affect the general populace. But we all know that there's always going to be a special interest in whatever policy, whether local or national, where you may have policies that may not directly benefit the general populace, but it does benefit their special interest. But I think that's what public policy is.
I think that's a good point, Curnis, just in terms of the way that policies have been designed historically. Basically, if you are fortunate enough to be, and by fortunate I mean that in the way of wealth, fortunate enough to be a policymaker, to be able to have been elected, then what you are representing really should be the interest of your constituents. However, I think we know from history that policies have often been made and legislation passed that doesn't benefit everybody. But you can be sure that the policies that are put forth certainly benefit at least those folks that are making them, and at least those folks that the people that those folks are considering. And so I think that's a good point, just in terms of who's making the policy and who that policy is designed to benefit, or who it ultimately does benefit.
Yeah, and so Imani, you said that there has to be a consensus around like the or there should be at least, right? This is a problem that exists, and we think that is a problem, and we think that it is the government's job to fix it, right? So nobody feels the government's job to fix it. They say it's a problem, but somebody else needs to worry about it. Now, and Curnis and Naya, you guys were talking about the special interests and things like that. Now, I know I don't I don't have my representative on speed dial or my senator, and I'm not sitting down writing letters or calling or emailing my politicians. And yet, a lot of times we hear our politicians and our representatives say, "I'm doing this on behalf of the people." How do they know what the people want, right? Are they actually representing people, or are policies kind of being, is this really special interest in wholly and solely?
Yeah, I was gonna say, oh, go ahead, Curnis.
I was just gonna say it's a combination of them. I mean, the thing is, these are people. They're human beings, and I'd imagine that, I would hope that the majority of the people that are going to make a law get into the whole business of being an elected official because they want to make positive change for the places they represent. I can imagine though, when they get to wherever they are, they're probably interacting a lot unless they're taking it upon themselves to go to the communities to figure out what the community wants. You got a whole group of folks whose job is to feed them information based on certain needs that are out there for whatever they're called lobbyists. That's part of it if you got the legislature. But you still have these same people that go into, to speak to your alderman and things. So I think what's important, is, making sure, I think it's important if you have an elected official that they are actually polling the people that they represent on big issues to make sure that they are making the decision in the best interest of those that are represented. And hey, I get it too. People are people. We all get busy. We can't think about the state legislature. I mean, the state legislatures. There are thousands of bills that get introduced, and most of them die. And and there's still quite a few of them that make it through in the end. Neither one of us has the time to go through each one of those and know what happens. But I do think that if it does get to the point where, as the re-election time comes up, you do need to look back at the record and see if what was decided upon by that legislator matches with what your beliefs are. And if they don't, that's your opportunity to change policy through a vote.
Yeah, I know. One of the things that I think about from policy and representative is we often complain about, hey, this person is doing this person is doing that, and yet a lot of times we don't like vote. When I say we, collectively America, if you look at, I love the graphic where it shows the last election and it talks about, hey, you know, uh, Trump won by this amount of votes, and X amount of people didn't vote, right? Which is greater than the amount of people, amount of votes that he lost by. And so it shows that we collectively are not participating as much as we probably should, especially when we know like decisions that, as President Trump said in the debate, like elections matter, elections have consequences. And so when we don't make our voice heard, whatever that voice may be, like we definitely can disagree on whatever you're putting forth, but at least we've got to engage in that. And so I was wondering too, how do we influence people to get engaged? Because a lot of times we focus on the federal level, right? And so we talk about, we spend all this time every November, every 4 years, complaining and getting on Facebook and rah and for our candidate. And then after that, it's like 4 years of silence. And so, what are some of the ways that people can get engaged in policy, at education policy, economic policy, and things like that?
I think one of the most pressing needs, obviously, is voting, but beyond voting, right? Let's assume that everybody goes out and votes. I think it's really important for folks to just understand how policy manifests in your life on a day-to-day basis and what the origin of those policies are. I think that, yes, your elected officials are the folks who are making policy. Policy is happening in your city halls. It's happening in your local planning and zoning commissions. It's happening in your school board meetings and rooms, as well as in state houses and on the Capitol. But all of those policies are rules and tweaks and guidance that show up in aggregate in the way that you see the world around you, that your neighborhood looks, that your life is able to be lived. I have a quote from a book that I read, which has nothing to do with policy, but it basically is just that, whether you are engaged in it or not, the life gets lived, which basically is just a reflection on life. Whether you are engaged in it or not, the policy gets made, right? And so you can engage in it and seek to influence it, right? Or you cannot engage in it and somebody else will make it for you. And your interests specifically will not be reflected unless by some coincidence your interest happens to be aligned with that of someone else or another party. So I think one of the key ways for people to start getting involved in policy is to understand that there's this entire spectrum of activity happening in policymaking that affects their daily lives, and understand where and how they can plug into to making changes there.
Yeah,
I also
before you jump in, Imani, one of the things I do want to encourage people, if you're watching this, please engage with us in the comments. I got this fancy thing that I kind of like that I could put it up on the screen. And so Delane says, I probably got to think of layout, but Delane says, yes, great point, Naya. People really don't understand how it impacts their daily life. They don't see how it applies to them directly. And I think that's one of the main reasons people don't engage, because they don't think that their voice matters, and they don't think that what people do when they get there is going to actually impact them. Go ahead, Imani, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna say that, like, um, I agree with everything that Naya just shared. And also, like, there's a reason why um, policy and politics feels um, difficult for people to get to access. It doesn't feel accessible. It doesn't feel, and I mean, I'm obviously speaking in generalizations, but like, there are things that I am learning now um, that I had no idea about. And I've been in the workforce for years. And so there are layers to this type of work and this sector that are by design difficult for people to access and to understand. And so I guess I say that because I want to name and recognize that, like, if you don't work in policy as your job, it can be a whole nother job just to try to understand policy, um, and figure out how and where and when you should particularly engage. And that is why I, you know, in my work and also personally, um, think that there's a lot of value in um, advocacy groups. I think there's a lot of value in groups that are whose job it is to distill this information and these very sort of big, complex, heavy, wordy um, things for people to be able to come into some understanding about what they do and don't mean. And I think, it is. I would recommend for anyone who is interested or cares, like, if education is your jam, like, find some advocacy groups that are in your local community that are talking about what the issues are and sharing that information with the community. If it's housing, if it's healthcare, whatever it is, I guarantee you there's a group who is trying to get that information to the masses so that they can be informed, and so that they can sort of engage in the process. And then really quickly, you touched on it, Keon, but like, also just understanding the levels of government and who is responsible for what. Because Naya was mentioning school boards, and, like, you know, a lot of people think that way more funding for schools comes from the federal government. And it doesn't. It's a very, very, very small percentage. Most of the money for your schools comes from your local taxes, and next coming from the state. And so, even knowing if I'm gonna call somebody and go off on you, let me make sure I'm calling the right. Like, let me just make sure I'm at the right altitude for whoever I need to call to go off on because I'm mad about, the school lunches or whatever. But that is also a part of it, and that also speaks to the complexity, and how it can feel, I think, challenging and difficult for people to even know, like, it's like, double dutch, like, where do I get in? What's going on,
Yeah, I also think, and these are great points. I'm gonna fully admit, I'm not a policy person. I'm a practitioner of economic development, but I'm still affected by policy. But one thing I think is really important too, because Imani, you made a good point. Like, there's so much that's involved. It's hard for any one person to distill it down, in the midst of their daily lives. Um, I think what's also important, in addition to the advocacy groups, I think it's really important to have policy institutes or whatever these nonprofits that are nonpartisan that take particular issues and studies the issue, because I think sometimes it's easy to take a gut reaction to things, but these organizations are pulling in data, and so they're helping people make decisions based on data, and they're focusing on that, and I think I think that's really important towards policy making. I think it's really dangerous to make a policy based on good feeling and not based on true data and information.
Yeah, and that gets on. So Naya and I were having a conversation. Well, there are two things. One of the things I think that's helpful for people is one of the things. I like reading stuff. I like knowing everything. I hate when I don't know something and somebody else knows. I'm like, man, I need to be a little bit more studied. And so, but one of the things that's helped me specifically as it relates to Orlando is to find even some of the popular, like, local blogs or popular local things that aren't as data heavy, but they're reporting on, hey, this just happened at the municipal planning board. And that's one of the things I actually enjoy doing is every month, the city of Orlando has a municipal planning board, and they meet and they talk about the plans that people are putting forth. And you begin to see, like in Orlando, hey, somebody put something up at John Young and Princeton. Okay. Somebody put some, in for John Young a little north of Princeton. Somebody put something at OBT in Princeton. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on at OBT in Princeton that is that you don't see physically happening yet. I mean, now it's happened, but all those plans were being put into place before the roads got developed and before the construction started. And so when we think about opportunities for people who are like, I want to be where the next thing is happening, you've got to be aware of those things. And a lot of times the popular blogs are talking about things that happen. And so that's one aspect. And I would suggest any and everybody find a local, area blogger that's, that you enjoy reading and follow that. But then Naya and I were talking about, I think you maybe mentioned the book, The Death of the Expert or something like that. Was it you I was talking to, Naya? Was that not you?
No, I mentioned a whole bunch of books, but
You
I don't know
do.
what
You have books galore to mention. Well, anyway, somebody I was talking to mentioned this book called The Death of an Expert, and was talking. Oh no, it was another podcast I was listening to, called Southside Rabbi by this rapper KB. But the guy was talking about how because of social media, we have now gotten to the point where, going to Curnis's point, we will see data. People will see data from non-biased institutions and non-partisan institutions and say, no, I don't want to hear that. I saw on YouTube this guy from down the street talking about X, Y, Z, this, that, and the third. And so I'm going to believe him or her over this group who literally says, my whole thing is education. I just care about the kids, and I want to do whatever I can to help them. And we jettison their thoughts and their work and say, well, that guy, his kid goes to that school, so he's an expert. And that's such a sad state of our society that we have now lost respect for medical experts and education experts and things like that. So I think that's tragic. And I want to share that.
It is, but I think it speaks to and we may be going off a little bit, but
that's good. This is me all day. This is my life off.
Well, I think in any, look, policy should be some version of healthy debate, because anything that's proposed is going to have two sides. I mean, it's going to be someone's going to be for it, someone's going to be against it, or it may not even be for or against. It might be point and counterpoint. And if we lose this ability to have healthy debates surrounding an issue, then policy is in trouble. Because to your point, what's going to happen is, which has happened, whatever group has the strength in numbers to make a policy happen, to push a policy forward, that's going to be the policy, regardless of what, there may be a bunch of counterpoints against that policy that would be detrimental to the society, but if that group has the power, it's happening. So I to your point, I do think that we need to make sure that there needs to be some safe space for the public and honestly, that should be within, if it's a legislative issue, it should be within our state houses. It should be at the Capitol. We know that's not happening.
Right.
So there should be some place where we can have a safe space where we can have healthy public debate on issues so we can craft a more inclusive policy on things.
I also, go ahead, Imani, you came off mute.
Oh, you're good. Go ahead.
Okay. I also am really struck, Kian, by the points that you made about checking and seeing what's happening at the local planning board, and you find out about stuff in advance. I think it's important for us to sort of situate ourselves in the moment that we're in sort of the history of public policy, and the ways in which certain groups have been intentionally excluded from and disenfranchised from policy. Disenfranchisement of the vote is a huge part of that, but it's really only the beginning, because the vote really just puts the legislators in place. Then beyond that, it's, how does advocacy happen? Who's lobbying for what? Right down at the local level, all the way up to the federal and Senate and the Congress level. And who has the agency and the power to advance certain types of, certain policies that will, that may benefit them. Obviously, we are all of us on this call, Black and African American specifically. And Kia,
We are.
you are African
That's
American.
news to me. No, I'm just kidding.
Notify you that this is happening. You're super light, but you're African American.
I think I got him. I think I got him now. Yeah.
You got him a little bit. You got him a little bit, Curnis. But I mean, I think that it's important to note, the way that you talked about what's happening on Princeton and John Young, folks that aren't from Orlando. These are parts of Orlando that are undergoing big booms. What happens though is you're living in a city or you're living in a place and stuff just is happening. Your school is used to be good and now it's sort of it's not as good. Stuff is popping up in your neighborhood or not popping up in your neighborhood. Land is getting bought, trading hands. You don't know, and folks don't know about it. But back to situating ourselves in the context of history, so much of the way that policy was done, I mean, up until very recently, comparatively, really excluded Black people. And so the fact that intentionally excluded Black people, and the policy was not for us. It was for white folks. And so the fact that we don't know on a lot of folks don't know or are not fully engaged in the policy space really is just a function, in my view, of history. I think that even with that, you have had significant movements of engagement by Black and other excluded populations for the duration of the history of this country. But one of the things that is produced by that history is sort of a feeling, this kind of idea of locus of control, internal locus versus external locus of control. You see stuff happening around you. You don't really know how to affect it. You try to affect it. You're like Imani said, you're operating at the wrong latitude, or altitude, whatever, and you're not able to get anything done. And that starts to feel like I don't have any power. And what that produces is folks that don't make as significant of an effort to, or don't even know how. I'm going to say it's an effort issue, but don't know how to engage and believe that things happen to them as opposed to that they can affect things. So I think one of the really important things for us to change is people's understanding of where and how to engage and how things can be changed.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think like I don't, obviously people who are like, I'm not gonna vote, Black people specifically, I understand the frustration with that statement and like the inclination and like the gut reaction to just be like, are you crazy? And also I understand that there's, residual trauma that exists in Black communities from decades of disenfranchisement on top of century, like all of the things that we know to be true. And so when I hear people say that, I ask for their reasoning. And now sometimes the reason is just dumb, and that's fine. And then, I can go with my gut reaction. But, a lot of times you hear what Naya just said, which is like, it's not going to make a difference. And some people may think that that's a dumb answer. To me, that's an answer that needs some interrogation and some probing to figure out where along the trajectory of your, lived experience did you lose faith in this institution that we know as democracy? Did you ever have faith in this institution called democracy? Let's talk about why that is. And then I think it's like, and now let's talk about what it looks like for you to engage, and for your engagement to feel like it's actually meaningful. And that doesn't have to mean all the time my candidate won, right? But I do think that people need to see themselves in the democratic process, and people need to see themselves as players and real actors that have something to contribute to the democratic process. Because like anything else, if they don't, of course they're going to opt out.
Well, I think y'all made a good point too. Was it? I think Naya mentioned something about the vote is important, but that's the start of it. There's a lot more involved in it. Case in point, I know it looks like here in Jackson, the city of Jackson, they're starting to revisit their comprehensive plan because every so many years, cities and counties, they can do the same, but most time in cities, they engage in what's known as the comprehensive planning process. And this is really important because this is really the roadmap for the city in terms of zoning and planning and development um, for many years to come. That's what they use as a guide. And so right now, typically there's these community meetings but due to COVID, they're having to do it a different way. But the city of Jackson is actually soliciting feedback from the citizens, asking for input on the plan based on different questions. Wherever you are, whoever's listening, if you ever get approached with something like that, if your city or county is engaged in any kind of planning process, comprehensive plan, you need to make sure you submit feedback on that because that does affect policy. So I know that's the reason I'm glad Nayan brought up that point. And Imani hit the same thing. We get excited about voting. We get excited about, my candidate won or my candidate lost or whatever. But there's a whole lot of time in between where things are happening, and there are direct requests for you to engage. Now, I do think you should engage if you can, outside those requests. But if you get asked by your local city to engage in a process that helps to shape that city, definitely do so and don't ignore it.
Yeah, that makes me think of when I lived in Dallas, there was a trail called Katy Trail, and it was really cool because it would take you pretty much from downtown north. I don't know how far it went, but it would take you north, and it was nice. And I know the city of Orlando is actually thinking about bike trails and things like that now. And so where I live is a historically black area, and let me tell you what we don't have. But trails. And so when you look at the map, is this idea, when you look at the map, there's stuff north of where we are, and west of where we are, but things in the middle where I am, it just doesn't exist. And when you think about like health and wellness and safe spaces for things like that to occur, if none of us from the community are saying, hey, it would be nice if there was a bike path or trail or running trail in our neighborhood, the city is never going to put it there because the excuse is going to be the demand for trails is highest here, so let's deploy our resources there. So that was a great point.
And here, people don't need an excuse to not put bike trails in Washington stores.
Right. That's good point.
Point of just counterpoint there. And I guess I say that to say that a part of the reason why you can look at a map and see spaces where things have happened, where there are bike trails and wellness and grocery stores, etc., is that if you take that map and overlay on top of it a redlining map, you'll see that the area that you live in was a redlined area. Right. And so what you're dealing with in your community in Washington Shores, where I grew up, where Imani and I grew up, and in my neighborhood in DC in Deanwood, and I don't know much about where you guys are from, but if it happened to be a predominantly black neighborhood, then probably the same thing there is, that there are more food deserts. There's more likely to be a food desert. There's less likely to be high quality, schools that are high performing schools. A lot of that gets, blamed on or placed at the feet of residents. But the reality is that disinvestment that has happened over generations, right? Intentional disinvestment in communities has rendered certain communities almost incapable of experiencing or manifesting growth without some significant assistance. So one of the things I want to put forward here is that we're in an age now of where there's a lot of consideration of racial equity and justice, and there's equity and justice is getting sprinkled on everything, and for good reason, right? But a lot of what we see, and from a policy perspective, what we had for so many generations was race-biased policy that produced racist outcomes in communities. And those race-biased policies, anti-Black and anti-other but white policies, were replaced by race-neutral policies. Well, those race-neutral policies, came in and sort of on top of folks in communities that had already been, intentionally left behind. and didn't even the playing field. Really, what we need to see moving forward to really see corrective action is positive race bias policies that take into consideration the extent to which certain groups have been negatively impacted and disenfranchised. And that doesn't necessarily mean, the policy needs to say Black people X, Y, and Z, but it needs, Cory Booker put forth a policy that was called like a 30-30-10 or something like that, that basically said, that X percent of, 30%, I think it was actually 10, 20, 30, some percent of the federal funding that goes to communities should go to communities that have experienced some percent of, of low AMI for some extended number of years, right? And so what that would do is basically ensure that more resources go to communities that have been perpetually disinvested and perpetually disenfranchised. So I want to put that forward just from the standpoint of education and economic development, because how neighborhoods show up today really is a function of housing policy for the past however many generations in this country.
But to that point, Naya, like my initial comment about like how do I define public policy, and it's being a problem that's like at that intersection. When you look at education policy in this country through the lens of race and equality and equity, and you think about the landmark case of Brown v. Board, like in retrospect, that was not the problem that was addressing, was not the problem of racial, and the problem that was addressing is separate, inherently unequal. What it was not addressing was all of the underlying and causal circumstances that led Black people and Black schools to be in the conditions that they were in, and white schools to be in the condition that they were in. And so when the courts offered that ruling and that opinion, and said, separate is inherently unequal, and so now you have to desegregate, that led to the approach of like, now we've solved the problem. We solved the problem because now the schools can no longer be separate, and so therefore they will be equal, as opposed to understanding and recognizing that there was a need for a tremendous series of wrongs to be righted. And so now when Naya talks about, race neutral, Brown v. Board actually set policy in this country up so that people cannot now look at things like race as factors for things like, whether you get into a certain selective school or whether you don't. So it actually had the opposite effect, because folks could claim, no, we have Brown v. Board, that we checked that box. Right. And so now we just take race completely out of the equation. And so what you see now are Supreme Court cases where white parents are saying, my child's rights have been encroached upon because there are school districts that are trying to tackle the issue of integration. And so they're using race as one of many factors of like how a child gets placed in a certain school or in a certain, district. And white parents are saying like, that's actually like racist against me and my kid. And they're winning those cases. And so, I think that like the answer is race consciousness. Like there has to be a recognition that race is it's a social construct, sure, but in this country, it is a real thing that had real consequences. But when you do this race neutral thing, it's like, hey, everybody's just, we're all the same color on the inside type thing. And then it eliminates any pressure or need to actually address the fact that inequity is still there.
Yeah, that makes me so. I always want to bring in a couple quotes. One quote or a quote in a book. One quote has to do with Martin Luther King. It wasn't in Why We Can't Wait. It was Where Do We Go From Here? Community of Chaos. And he says, when you've done so much against a people for so long, you have to do something specific for a people to correct the issue, not simply stop doing that which you were doing against them. And so that makes me think also of a book that I always recommend to people called The Color of Law, which is talking about housing policy. It's a very good book. It was nothing, at least for me, new from a conceptual standpoint, but the level of research and detail at which the author works all of that out is amazing. One thing he talks about is when America began to expand west, one of the things that they did was build public housing right next to where the factories and things were. But they were specifically for white Americans. Like, you could not be a black American there. Well, when the workforce began to grow, like the demand or the supply of workforce was not as much as demand, then they started to tap into African American workforce. But what they did was they built public housing further away. And so now you've got the economic disadvantage of, and just social disadvantage of, I've got to spend more to get there. I've got to take more time to get there. And it just makes it a much more difficult situation. So when we talk about the history of policies and how they've created environments and things like that, you got to do something to correct that. I do want to bring in this comment. Somebody says, community leader here, Cameron says, community leader here, not sure where to even begin. How can we discern if we have race bias policies currently at play in our communities? Anybody want to give that one a shot? I'm going to say, if there's a policy in place, it probably is race bias, just as a general principle.
I saw that this question came up recently. Basically, you'll know whether the policy is race biased if the outcomes are racist. So if the outcome of a policy is producing disproportionately positive results for one group versus another, then the policy is oriented towards that benefiting group, right? Regardless of whether that was the intent.
That's a great answer.
Right. Nail on the head.
Yeah.
Also, Jason, speaking to what you were saying, Curnis, about being involved in the local level, he said the most important input you can have is at the local level first. You have the biggest impact there. Local engagement is the best thing you can do. And so I think that's again, one of the things that we miss out on, is that even if we effect change. So I think about education and integration. So my hobby horse is how integration was a great thing, right, in a conceptual standpoint, right? But the implementation, we began to say, what happened to black neighborhoods? Well, we didn't think about what happens with integration is not that, okay, everybody succeeds. It's what are been historically predominantly white institutions, predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly white organizations, all that begin to say, okay, black talent here, black talent there, black talent there. Okay, you guys come in, and so now you have an entire community that was thriving in its context at that time, now diminished of its resources, both financial and human. And so a lot of unintended consequences happen. Think about integration of schools, right? Well, we then have a lot of private schools start to pop up, and it's like, oh, such and such academy or such and such preparatory is a fine institution. Yeah, it is, but it also was started because white parents didn't want their white kids going to school with black kids. And so, a lot of unintended consequences happen when we try to implement policy, even the best of policies. So I don't know where I was going with that, but that's where I went.
No, that's good. I've been trying to figure out how to answer this. I know. So if y'all hadn't heard, Deion Sanders is going to be the new head coach for Jackson State University.
He's cool. Yeah, he's been all over the place with that.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So, and I'm gonna try to tie this in since we got on race, but I mean, if you think about it, like, at one point we were not able to go to white institutions. We all know that. This kind of white institutions were for white folks. And in fact, they created some of the public institutions just to keep us out of their institutions. So, and then we had to create our own institutions. And to get to your point on integration, I mean, it got to a point where we can go anywhere. And I'm going to the athlete side. Hey, if you have a choice between being on TV for a SEC game versus being on the PEG network, the public access network, something that everybody can't see, for a game in the HBCU, then if you feel like you have the potential to go to the NFL, you want to be seen. So I can see that. And so a lot of the top athletes did start leaving. So whereas at one point we used to get Jerry Rice's and Walter Payton's coming out of, HBCUs, and that's another Mississippi shout out, by the way. But now you're seeing these athletes coming out of traditionally white institutions. The cool thing about Deion Sanders, I think, I don't know how he's going to be as a coach. I hope he'd be great. The school he came from, the high school, was great. But what I see, and the way I'm trying to tie this back into what we're talking about, is I can see him. He's already incited some recruits that plan on going to traditional white institutions to change their mind and come to an HBCU, which is Jackson State. And I can see, like, if he got to the point where he built the team, because Jackson State has not had a winning season in quite some time. But if he could build a team that could kill it in the SWAC, can build a team that can kill it for exhibition games for Mississippi, so the Mississippi States, the USMs, the Ole Misses, the white institutions. And then if he could get it to the point somehow to get invited to play some of the larger schools, I think it'll put Jackson State on the map. And I think it would change the narrative of, the recruitment of athletes, which, and what I'm getting at is athletes, if they get recognition at HBCUs, we'll be able to recruit more Black athletes to HBCUs, which will strengthen HBCUs, at least the athletic program, and strengthen the resources, which is the money that comes there, and pull back revenue that we've been missing from HBCUs. I think similar things have happened to neighborhoods. I mean, it's kind of like, so when you think about it, if you have a choice between, I've been living in this house forever and I've been blocked out from everywhere else, and I have opportunity to go elsewhere. Well, when they open up the opportunity, it's not that I don't like my neighborhood. It's just I'm going to go ahead and take up the opportunity to move elsewhere in what I seem to be better. I think in terms of neighborhoods, we have an opportunity to change that narrative. I hate it, but for whatever reason, people, there's a, I'm not going to say people in general, but there's a subset of people that feel like better equals white, and that's not the case. Black people, we have resources, and I think we have to pool them together and invest them in our own neighborhoods. On policy as well, we got the Community Reinvestment Act. I don't know who's monitoring that, but banks are supposed to be lending within neighborhoods where they're taking deposits. So if you got a bank that's taking deposits, but you got to go downtown to go, drop off your deposit and get your loans, they're supposed to be reinvesting in your community. And someone needs to make sure that that's happening for those communities. Those are communities of color. That's the reason they have the Community Reinvestment Act. Same thing with community development entities. I think I heard Naya say that she worked for. Did you say you worked for a community development entity?
Worked for CDFI for a period of time.
Yeah. So similar situation. You have all these smaller institutions whose whole role is to try to reinvest in these communities that have been traditionally ignored. Those should be supported, and a lot of those are starting to get the funding. I know here locally, we have Hope Credit Union, Netflix. They've started dishing out a lot of money. I forgot they gave them like $10 million to be invested in Black businesses, Black home ownership. Those are things. So policy, I think, policy is good it's a both and. It needs to be something that comes from the public side, but especially in this moment, it can be something that comes from the private in terms of making sure that they're investing in communities that they serve.
And I think too, so when you start talking about housing and living in Black communities, that's speaking my language right there. Because I think, like you said, a lot of times people think I'm going to move better, and better means a non-Black neighborhood or white neighborhood specifically. And so when I think about policy, a lot of times policy, especially at the local level, gets implemented because people begin to say, I want to see something here, right? And so I think we, especially at this point, because, you know, none of us, I don't think anybody on this call would be considered, part of the lower class of Americans, right? I don't think we're the bottom 1%, or whatever. I don't know what lower class cutoffs are, but
we're not low wage earners.
sorry, thank you. That's probably lower class is probably derogatory. I appreciate you. We're not low wage earners. And so we have the ability to choose, as you were saying, Curnis. And so we can choose to live here or we can choose to live there. I think one of the problems we have from a black community is that the housing stock is just not as appealing to those who have a choice, because a lot of the homes in traditional black neighborhoods are the ones that were built post-war, right? And they have the same piping and the same all that stuff, versus a lot of times young black professionals are moving to areas where Pulte Homes or some other home builder has come and just built a whole bunch of new nice homes, and so it's a little bit more enticing. But I think if we are to change the narrative around black communities, we have to, as a group of people, say, hey, I want to see neighborhoods, businesses have a nice exterior. So we need some facade money. City of Orlando or County of Orange or wherever you are, invest it right here in this area. And we have the ability to do that, but we have to do it because, as Naya said, people don't need an excuse not to do anything, right? They just
But it's still hard, Key, and I think that it's important to highlight that. I know we're at the top of our hour, but I just want to highlight just like a couple of things from Curnis's point. I think what you talked about sports and athletes and HBCUs versus predominantly white institutions is sort of a parable for the concept of how movement happens. But what that parable represents is the fact that separate, to Imani's point, has not meant equal, right? Still, right? So integrated has not meant equal. I'm sorry, I apologize. And so what that means is that you've got predominantly Black schools, predominantly Black neighborhoods, predominantly Black, areas that have been, again, so deeply disinvested in that there are not as great a level of opportunities for people who live there or folks that, in the case of HBCUs who go to school, to basically believe that they can have access to all that there is to be able to access. And so really where the problem comes in is, on the one hand, prior to integration, we had Black folks and other people of color not being able to access what were opportunity communities, basically at that time, predominantly white communities, where all the money was. You weren't able to live there. You couldn't access it. But on the flip side of that, you had Black communities that were completely disinvested in. If we want to see the types of outcomes where folks can have, everybody has access to be able to, achieve the greatest things that they can achieve, we've got to ensure that places that are high opportunity, that everybody has access to those places, to live there, to work there, to go to school there, but also that places that have been disinvested in can be turned into opportunity communities by having real investments happen in those communities. I think one of the challenges is that, significant aspects of the way that we view, not we, but that the collective this country sort of views things that are Black, is that they are not as good, not as, not as positive as, there's not as much opportunity, there's not going to be as much outcome. But all research has shown that to be false. Every piece of research on that subject has shown it to be false. Empowering and ensuring access to opportunity for Black people and other disenfranchised populations has always resulted in the expansion of the pie in this country, right? And so all that we are doing collectively as a country by not ensuring that Black kids are going to schools where there's great opportunity, or that folks aren't living in neighborhoods where there's great. All we're doing is ensuring that the pie never grows for everybody else. And there's a really good book called The Riches of This Land by Jim Tankersley that just came out that really makes that case. The economic imperative of removing barriers for Black people specifically, and immigrants, and to a lesser degree, but still relevant, women, folks that have been excluded, basically. And so I think that a part of the process, and Kian, I hope you'll invite us back to talk about housing, because when we get into that, is basically that we have to be able to believe as a country, and come up with that consensus that Imani talked about, that there is real opportunity by opening the doors to access for folks that have been excluded.
I also just want to add, because I'm at the end, because I know we're almost at time, that I don't want us to forget or lose sight of the fact either that in the history of this country, in many times when Black people have been shut out and excluded from economic opportunity that is offered to the masses, they have created enclaves and communities that are functioning,
Preach.
wealthy, all the things, and white people have come and burned them to the ground. So I just want to make that statement, because I think it's an important part of the story and the trajectory, in the same vein as whoa, why don't these people go out and vote? Well, you were lynching people for voting for 45 years, so maybe that has something to do with it. And so, in the same vein, when Black people have said historically in this country, okay, well, we can't go to your bank, we can't go to your school, we can't go to your whatever, we will just have our thing over here. And then it's prosperous and it gets destroyed. And so I think that we have to have a collective, I'm not saying, that we should, retreat and accept defeat, but I do think that we have to have a collective memory and understanding of who we are and what we have done and what we are capable of, and the many ways at every sort of turn that through policy or through practice or through violence, this country has, sought to sort of keep us excluded. And so anyway, I just wanted to add that little nugget of context, because I think it's important.
Burned it down. Yes, thank you. Curnis, since we're doing final comments, you want to go ahead? Do you have any final comments?
I just really enjoyed the conversation. I think, we've covered a lot on this. We're all impacted through policy, and whether you know it or not. So, I think the best thing, I think Imani mentioned that, she didn't mention it this way, but find your tribe. If there's something that you're passionate about in your city, find people that you can link up with to try to affect something, positive change towards whatever policy you want to have implemented.
Thank you. I feel like I could go on and on and on, and if y'all probably know, if you let me, I will go on and on and on. But for the sake of respect of your time and probably my wife's time with the kids, bless her, I want to end here. But I thank you all. If you're watching and you did not comment, please leave a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts, get your engagement about what policies have impacted you, what policies that you think should be in place. Or just any of your thoughts on that, because I think collectively it's helpful to see other people's ideas. So, but until the next time, this is all in context. Thank you, Naya. Thank you, Imani. Thank you, Curnis. Y'all have a wonderful night.
Bye, Sam.